Hello, and welcome to today's health webinar. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Microsoft. We would like to remind you that the Q&A feature is available, so feel free to send in your questions and comments throughout today's webinar. We would love to hear from you. And with that, I will turn it over to our moderator, Kimberly Noel.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session today, AI Frontiers in Healthcare, Driving Innovation Through Collaboration. I'm Dr. Kimberly Noel. As I mentioned, I'm dialing in from Roche headquarters in Basel, Switzerland. I'm the global lead of AI advocacy and digital health, and I'm happy to moderate this important conversation. As we all know, healthcare systems across the globe are facing urgent challenges, from the rising disease burden to clinician burnout to the persistent gaps in health equity and access. And today's conversation is how AI can help address those healthcare issues. Our goal is to explore how collaboration across Europe with researchers and health tech leaders can enable a better care experience and also address health equity. We have an exciting program ahead, and we will discuss how to operationalize responsible AI in healthcare and the insights into measuring AI projects. Finally, we'll open the floor to Q&A and give you an opportunity to engage with our experts. But before we start, I'm pleased to introduce you to our speakers who bring a wealth of expertise to the topic. Dr. Rue, would you like to begin?
Oh, hi, everyone. Just trying to get the lighting here so you can see me here. Hi, everyone. David Rue. I'm the Global Chief Medical Officer for Microsoft. Been in healthcare technology for the past 30 plus years, and very focused on how technology, and in particular AI, can help improve health outcomes, access to care, quality of care, patient safety, and ways that we can do it in a way that is equitable across all populations.
And we also have Dr. Van Genderen. Can you please introduce yourself?
Oh, hello, everybody. Thanks for being here. So my name is Michel van Genderen in Dutch. So the G is always difficult for English-speaking persons. I'm an attending ICU physician at the Erasmus Medical Center in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. We have the largest capacity in terms of ICU beds of West Europe, and we are the largest hospital in the Netherlands. So for 50% of my time, I'm now focusing on direct patient care. And the other 50% of my time, I'm focusing on how to develop innovative technologies in a way that they can truly be operationalized at the bedside. Because in the end, that's what we want, and that's what we need. The main focus of all these innovative technologies is obviously focusing on AI. I'm also the lead of AI in the hospital. I'm an associate professor in this topic, and I'm now tutoring 23 PhD on how to not only develop but also responsibly implement AI solutions for healthcare challenges.
Wonderful. Let's dig right in. We want to share what our recent breakthroughs are, especially as Microsoft creates new initiatives and new collaborations with Erasmus. Dr. Rue, can you start with telling us what's the latest innovations in the last 6 months?
Yeah, it's been pretty exciting just in general. I think most people that are tracking artificial intelligence have seen the incredible capabilities that AI can provide. And this is obviously across every spectrum of life you can imagine, from consumer to even healthcare. We have had a tremendous amount of excitement around ambient voice, the ability for a clinician to have a conversation with a patient and to then enable that information to be transcribed into the format of a note. It saves the clinician a tremendous amount of time required to document to the EHR. This is actually something that has gained widespread interest. And in fact, just today, we announced that this is now available in the UK. So there's multiple countries now that have this capability. And we find this to be an extreme satisfier, not just for clinicians, but also for patients. It allows the patient to feel that their voice is heard and have the opportunity to spend time with the clinicians in a meaningful manner. So that's been, I'd say, been ongoing, and we're starting to see widespread interest and adoption in that area. But more recently, there have been some dramatic, I'd say, evaluations and launches of capabilities that are giving us insights of how AI could be applied to enable us to become much more efficient and do things that are traditionally very difficult to do. So one of those things is, and I'll use cancer care as an example, the ability for us to collaborate with individuals in a way that allows us to be able to understand what is the best treatment course and direct people to those courses. Now, this is something that's called multidisciplinary treatment or multidisciplinary care. It is something that we all agree is important. And in fact, if you were to look in cancer care, the ability for us to look at a patient's medical history, understand what are the potential treatment options, weigh that in balance with all the patient concerns and interests, that is something that occurs in these tumor board meetings. Well, those meetings, generally speaking, are very time consuming, both in terms of preparation and the need for us to schedule those appointments, and then even through the follow through. And what we found is that there's a lot of manual work done just in terms of preparing for it. If you think about the clinicians now spending time looking through the literature, pulling the medical records, summarizing all the visits, well, all of that now can be done in an automated manner. And it's using a format of AI that is becoming much more popular, and it's called agentic AI. What we're doing is we're breaking down the tasks into smaller components and using AI to address those smaller components. And then we're orchestrating this in a manner that allows us to be able to understand how this could be useful for a particular use case. So there's an agent that pulls information from the medical record. It summarizes it in a way that each visit has a full annotations relative to what has actually been reported in the summary. So for instance, if we said in the summary, the person was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, well, it would actually provide the references of how exactly that was done in that summary. And then it creates a longitudinal timeline, because this is oftentimes what's missing. The events and procedures done relative to each other. So we understand, has a person completed a full treatment course? Have they failed a treatment course? Are they eligible now for certain trials? And we can then do eligibility checks for clinical trials. And then we can query this with a series with another agent. And so this ability to use different agents for different tasks, all orchestrated, we call it the agent orchestration, is becoming one of the more exciting developments that is enabling us to think about how we can tackle complex tasks. And the evaluations of agent orchestration have demonstrated that it can perform as well, if not better than some of the standard LLMs that we traditionally use. So like single LLMs as a means, we actually leverage different types of LLMs within the agent orchestration. So we now are starting to realize that it's not that one LLM will solve all the problems or figure out the best LLM. It is really about how we can find ways to choose the right set of technologies for each specific subtask and then orchestrate it across an entire workflow. And so that has been really exciting to see. And then we've now just more recently done some evaluations where we've been looking at how agents can work together in a way that allows us to be able to solve complex tasks. We launched just I'd say maybe a month ago something called MAIDXO, and what it really is a long acronym that basically allows us to be able to understand that we can use AI potentially to help with the diagnostic decision making that clinicians often struggle with, specifically for difficult cases. And what it does is it actually was based off of the fact that we used over 300 New England Journal of Medicine case studies to create a mechanism where the agents themselves can first and foremost create a hypothesis, like identify what are the potential diagnoses. And then another agent could identify certain tasks that are associated, or I should say tests that are associated with it. And another one could look at the compliance with those tests relative to guidelines. And then another one could look at the cost effectiveness. And then another agent would look at whether or not there might be other alternatives. And all these agents working together in a manner where it's almost like they're like different people with specific expertise all working together. That gives us a new concept of agent to agent with human oversight that could potentially be utilized. So we're learning a lot right now. I think healthcare is in its early stages of understanding how AI can be best applied. We've got some great use cases right now with ambient, but we're going to be moving into some really exciting things down the road.
That's wonderful. I think we just started with agentic AI as a concept that started getting popular, and you're really talking about the next wave of technologies that helps clinicians in a meaningful way. And Dr. Michel van Genderen, how's that? I'd love to switch it to you to talk about what this means at Erasmus and how you are also leveraging AI technologies.
Yeah. So I would very much like to continue on what David already has mentioned, is that besides the solutions that will come our way, I think that we should start with the fundament that we now have in healthcare, and that is the fact that we are now just starting to learn how these technologies work, how to make them work, and in the end, how to operationalize them in clinical settings, whether it's an ambient solution or an agentic AI solution or predictive complex AI model. If you now look at what is already being used in healthcare settings, we know that only less than 2% of the models is moving beyond the model development and prototyping phase. So that means that we have a huge challenge in making sure that what we are able to develop and what we are able to do truly is being adopted when we are at the patient's bedside. So that's what our focus is on the Erasmus Medical Center, how to bridge this gap from an AI solution or AI tool to truly operationalization. So let me just give two very simple, but I guess very useful use cases so that we are doing together with Microsoft. The first is family meetings in the ICU. So we all know that I'm an ICU physician. So the majority of my work obviously goes to saving critical patients' lives, but also to informing the family members of the patients about their current status, about the development, but also the challenges we see in future times. And that's exactly where ambient AI scribes comes into place, because we tend to focus a lot on the healthcare specific tasks. But then again, we have to prepare these meetings, make sure that we give the right information to the patients. And obviously, in terms of legal compliance, and obviously because we have protocolized care, we have to write certain terminology in the EHR vendor system to make sure that my other colleagues knows what I said to the patient. So we know that the documentation time of these family meetings takes around about 15 to 30 minutes, because sometimes you have poor news meetings, sometimes you have update meetings. So what we did is we built an ambient AI scribe solution. We truly tested the pipeline. So we built a prompt. We made sure that everybody knew how it worked. And we just recorded family meetings in a real clinical setting. And what we noticed is that when you record a family meeting and you use ambient AI scribe solution to not only record it, but also to document it and directly put it in the EHR system, that it saves you 9 minutes per patient. And you should know that we have around about 30 to 40 minutes per week on our ICU. So that saves not only time, but it also lowers the documentation burden, and it gives us time to or either take a breather after the family meeting or just spend our time on more useful talks. And that is just focusing on the conversation itself. And after that conversation, not spend our time at a computer, but moving towards the patient care. That's actually where the work should be done. So I think that of all the possibilities, this is just a very simple solution that is now not only being talked about, the possible solution, but we truly developed in such a way that it is now being used in a clinical setting. And the paper will be published, I guess, within 2 months. So this is something for us that we are really proud of to build such a solution, but not to only build it, but also to implement it in our daily workflow, because that's where the challenge is. And so we're happy that we solved it together. Another project that we are now working on is making sure that we more move towards the complex solutions of AI in this terminology, agentic AI. So what every doctor wants to know is, if I have a certain patient with a certain disease and I diagnose the patient with disease, you first have to make sure that you insert the right diagnose, and then you make a treatment plan. But we all know that obviously you want to work according to the latest protocols. You want to adhere to your local protocols, but maybe also to the national protocols, and in this case also to the European protocols. So we have built an agentic AI solution that is able to interpret the diagnosis of the patient, move and look up your local protocols, but also the national and European protocols, and also even the latest literature, and to advise you whether you're protocol adherent or whether there are improvements in the treatment that you propose as a physician. And so we are now measuring the adherence to those proposals from AI, if doctors are willing to take the advice of AI. So my feeling is that it will not only improve care, but it will also make sure that probably it will improve the quality of care. So that's something we are now working on. And I'm really excited to find out if it will be adopted at the bedside, because that's what our focus is now on.
That's amazing. I mean, thinking of the impact on quality of care, it's really wonderful. Yeah. Thank you for sharing those developments. I'd like to switch the topics now to the collaboration in the European landscape. David, you've been a strong advocate for responsible AI in healthcare. Could you help us understand what responsible AI really means in practice, from principles to implementation, and why it's so critical as we think about scaling AI at this time?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think at Microsoft, we have always tried to do things in a way that adheres to principles that represent our understanding that the technologies themselves could potentially be not perfect, and that there's ways that we could potentially find them to be used that would lead to adverse outcomes. And so when organizations have looked at this concept of responsible AI, they've outlined a series of key principles that should be adhered to. It should be fair, it should be equitable, it should be understandable, it should be transparent. It should, there's a series of things that should be done. And we all agree in general to the principles. The challenge that we ran into, and this is in talking to many of our clients and partners, was, well, how do you take those principles and put it into action? Because there's just so many things that need to be done, and it was very unclear, like where do you start? And so when we started working with a lot of organizations, there were 5 questions that seemed to emerge consistently. And the first was, did you know all the AI that was running in your system today? So like just an inventory, an ability to register, to understand what's out there. That was like the first question that every system was trying to solve and answer. So that was the question 1. The second was, there was an assumption that the models that were created would work in your system. But we all know that that's not necessarily true, because the models are based off of the data sets that they were tested and validated on, but they may not be representative of your data. So to really make this something that we have higher confidence is going to work, you have to test it on populations that are very similar to yours, or like, somewhat similar. And then you have to ensure that that is done in a consistent manner. So like this testing on local data sets of patient populations that are consistent or similar to you, that actually isn't done a whole lot. And largely it's because we're so used to technology being something that gets sort of an FDA or a C mark, and we just assume that that means it's good to go. But what we're now realizing is that there has to be a level of testing. So that was number 2. And a corollary to 2 was, after it's been deployed, are we actually checking to see whether or not it's still working? the model, and if the outcomes are what we expected. Because there's sometimes these unintended consequences occur or they're implemented in different ways. And what we realized is that the post-deployment monitoring is extremely important for AI, much more so than for any other type of technologies that we've seen before. It's almost like we're thinking of a drug that we've now launched and we've tested it. Now we want to double check. That really is something that has been a big gap. And then the third was that we do know that the models themselves, even when tested on very large, diverse data sets, they oftentimes have inherent biases in the model and or in the way it's implemented. And the only way to know whether or not it's actually has those biases is you have to look at the models themselves. You have to see how it's being implemented. You have to look at the populations and the subpopulations, and you have to continue to do this in an ongoing manner. So this whole issue about bias assessment and monitoring was sort of another category. And then the last was there has to be some level of governance around this. It cannot just be the IT team is responsible for it. There has to be a governance that covers multiple different components, and you can't throw a zillion people at this. So streamlining that governance so that it requires as minimal number of people as possible and is an efficient process was sort of that fifth thing. And what we realized is that there are sites that are doing those five things, but not at scale. And it's because it requires too much time, resources. And so one of the things that we realize is we do need to think about how technology can help us automate some of those processes, and we can create more of an expedited, streamlined mechanism to do this. So it was last year, and we launched something called the Trustworthy and Responsible AI Network, or TRAIN, and this was launched at HIMSS, International Conference HIMSS. And during that time when we were launching this with the US, this is when we were in active conversations with several European hospitals. And Michelle from Erasmus was there. There was a variety of others. And they also had the exact same questions. And so working in collaboration with Michelle from Erasmus, Stefan from Skane, and there's a whole group of other hospitals, we launched an initiative very similar to the US. In fact, it's also the TRAIN initiative, but it is the TRAIN Europe. And so with that, I'm going to maybe pass it over to Michel to maybe talk a little bit about TRAIN Europe and then also some of the other activities that he's been involved in.
Thank you for this perfect explanation and all the challenges you just addressed, David. These are obviously global challenges. So we agree that every hospital, when utilizing AI, you should know from a director's point of view what models are running, what their data set is, and what the performance is, and on every time and every day. And that obviously touches the governance. So, but that being said, despite that you have global agreement on how you should move towards responsible operationalization of these models and how you should make sure that you have a solid infrastructure in your hospital or in any other way where you give access to healthcare. We also have regional challenges. So, for instance, in Europe, we are comparable to the US, but we have different countries. Every country in Europe has their own regulations. But obviously, from a European point of view, we have to make sure that we collaborate. And there you have European regulations. But besides that, there are also differences in, for instance, healthcare. So the definition of ICU patient in the US is not so comparable to that of a European country. So although we agree that we should have a global approach on how to define responsible AI, there are definitely regional challenges. So we then said, let's now start this Train Europe initiatives, where we have a tight link to the US and hopefully also to future regions in the world with other train initiatives. And hopefully David can elaborate on that after this explanation. But let's then focus on Europe, because we need to make sure that we develop solutions that are implementable and accessible for European countries only. I launched together with Stefan Jovinge, the Train Europe, and we are focusing on operationalizing these principles, but also making sure to define, okay, now if we in Europe build such a registry, on what particular points can we work together with the US, but what should we also implement in our registry that are typically specific for European legislation, but for European countries. And if we then solve this challenge, then probably we will also solve the challenge on that we work towards more data that is representable for the patients that it's being developed for. So in this case, we probably are able to share AI solutions in Europe, build them on European data sets, lowering the chances of algorithmic bias or inducing inequity or even harm to patients. So that's what we're hoping to get out of it. So another example is the cross collaboration that we also have with Microsoft, and that is another project we are doing, or I am doing, and that's the Indicate project. So, and that's a project to make sure that we first move towards data sets that are representative for the patients in the specific countries, in this case, a European country. So what we did, we now build a federated data approach for ICU patients in Europe. So we have built a network of 22 hospitals, and we are now trying to solve the data sharing. So by utilizing a federated data approach, you adhere to the legal representatives or the legal challenges in Europe by not sharing the data, but by only sharing the information of the data. And by making sure that every hospital has now access to this cloud environment, you can not only train models on more volume of data, but you can also train it on more specific data, and you are making sure that it is safe because you do not move with the data around, but the data stays in its place. So I think that is a very practical solution that we are now came up with. So first, now try to focus on regional challenges and local challenges by defining these Train Europe initiatives, making sure that all the AI hospitals and even the franchise are working together and agree on the global approach, and then move towards trying to solve it by now establishing that you share data and that you move towards getting more volume of data, that you have more power of these AI-based solutions.
Kimberly, I wanted to build off of what Michelle had talked about. There was a lot of interest in the US and in Europe on the Train initiative. And within each organization, it was very much a provider-led initiative. While Microsoft's involved, the providers really derive the agenda, the objectives, and really kind of help direct us. And one of the things that we had heard across this broad coalition of academic medical centers, health systems, and very small rural community-based centers was that a common theme was we all agree that responsible AI is important. We all agree that we need to operationalize it, but none of us have enough resources or time or money to be able to do this at scale. That was even with the academic medical centers and health systems. So as we honed in on that one particular issue of the fact that it's important, but we don't have the resources and the time and the money, we realized that there's three things that we might be able to do to help. I mentioned one, the technology and the tools to be able to do the automation and be the testing and the governance and things like that. That was where we started. But the second piece was around collaboration between members. And what we realized is that perhaps if members can all be evaluating the same type of models in the same way, we could share and learn from each other in such a way that maybe one site doesn't have to do all the testing or even the monitoring, but perhaps maybe they can learn from this network effect. And so creating a network was really the second opportunity. And so that allowed us to be able to alleviate or take off some of the burden from some of the sites. And the third, which is where we're striving for, is through partnerships with other partners that could actually do the testing and monitoring on behalf of the hospitals and health systems, as opposed to having the hospitals and health systems. And we're not quite there yet, but there is actually an initiative called the Alliance for Healthcare from the Eye that is looking to take on that task, where they will actually be doing the testing of retinal images for individuals to identify multiple different diseases. But in creating that large data set, they will be creating a marketplace so that other AI can be tested on those retinal images and before they get deployed and also post-deployment. And so this is where we'd like to push the industry towards, where it starts with each site kind of taking ownership, creating a network where you can work with other like-minded sites, and then expanding it to creating partnerships with technology companies that are all working towards the same goal. And I think that's one of the things that we're starting to see with respect to Train. Where is it heading? It's heading towards greater expansion through inclusion of more partners with a focus on how do we do this efficiently.
Yeah, and that's also one of the things we are now specifically seeing in Europe, is obviously that everybody has the same wish or the same desire. But now, for instance, in Europe, like what we are now seeing, and that I invite truly all physicians and hospitals to join, because we are struggling with the same challenge. And for instance, so two things I would like to address: this cross collaboration between hospital and industry. So we are now realizing in Europe that, you know, from the way we used to work or that we approached healthcare, is that it wasn't that common. But we are now starting to feel in these 25 hospitals we now have, that you should definitely work together with people with expertise, whether it's the industry or the pharmacy or companies that build AI solutions. Is that we should work together on that, because this field is moving so fast that we are unable to catch up. So we should learn from each other, but we definitely should approach this challenge in another way, and that is working together with industry and partners that have the expertise. So that's what we are now seeing in Europe, and that's what partners expect from us. Is, all right, how did you approach that contact? So what are your contacts? So very basic questions, but it's so needed. And then, what are your experience? And then, if you have now solved that challenge, okay, what would you advise me to do? What was your implementation strategy? Because we know that still less than 2% moved beyond prototyping phase. So how did you implement it? Did you, for instance, make sure that all your personnel was literate? And that is the second thing. We are in Europe focusing on a European AI literacy program from the Train perspective, because we discussed and we know that one of the major gaps that we should address is just trust, or the major challenges, I should say. And without trust, there's no adoption. And obviously, we know without adoption, it's useless. And what we saw is that one of the most, so from all the parameters we measured in more than 400 ICU physicians in Europe, we noticed that the strongest enabler of AI adoption and thus trust was AI literacy. So that's why we are focusing now on AI literacy. And that is something that I couldn't think of beforehand, but I now see that this Train Europe, this Train initiative is really pushing this agenda. And from that point of view, we hope to push AI adoption, trust, and also at the same time improving everybody's technical expertise.
I think that you guys are really honing in on the necessity to keep up with the technology, and partnerships and learning from each other is so essential to collaboration with industry and healthcare organizations. But I also want to call out some of the differences between the US and Europe, notably in the EU. You have the EU AI Act.
Exactly.
And Michel, can you speak more of some of the challenges that you're encountering in building centralized cross-border approaches to AI, and give examples? I think you had started to mention on Indicate, and delve a little bit deeper for us.
Yeah, so I can definitely do that. So we are in a extremely challenging time, with a lot of good things that can happen, but also real challenges, especially in Europe, because what Europe's now realizing is that you have global differences. So, for instance, different parts of the world have high capacity of chips or data, and we in Europe focus on legislation. And obviously, we applaud that because the culture in Europe is that first we would like very much for things to be responsible. But at the same time, we now notice that having European representative data is also important to train these models. So that's actually where Indicates comes in. But the challenge with Indicate is that you not only have regional legislation, but also European legislation. And despite that, we have the AI Act. I think the real challenge is making sure that you not only adhere to the European regulation, but also to the regional legislation. And the thing in Europe is that the regional legislation, so the legislation per country, is always dominant above the European one. So when we are building now this cloud-based access, we have to make sure that we adhere to every legislation of every country, and we had a lot of struggles with that. And also there are a lot of cultural differences. So for instance, we have access to all patient data in certain Southern European countries, while in the Northern European countries, if you want to train a model on patient data, so for instance, if you want to make sure that we connect it to the federated data space, then patient actively should give informed consent for an AI model being trained on their data. So these are the challenges we are now confronting with. So how then we should build such a data space if, for instance, in one Northern European country, one patient revokes their consent? Okay, how then to cope with that in terms of a federated data approach where, in fact, data is not being moved, but still now the output is being trained on the data. So then the hospital has to be in control of the data and has to have the ability to revoke the data out of the cloud access. So those are now the challenges we are confronted with in building this federated data approach. But nonetheless, I will attend a European committee conference at the end of this month. This is still the focus of Europe, to making sure that we enable this cross-country access of data, because from a European perspective, we have to make sure that we are able to share all this data to make sure that we have representative models in the next couple of years. And by making sure that it is federated, we also adhere to all the legal challenges, but also more importantly to the privacy challenges, because you do not ship the data. The second thing I would like to address is then you still have the responsible challenges. So what is actually then trustworthy AI? So what is trustworthy AI from a European perspective, but maybe also from a Dutch compared to a Spanish perspective? And that's why we in Erasmus also initiated the ethics lab. We have the real lab together with the World Healthcare Organization, with the WHO, to think about these solutions. Because obviously we can state that data needs to be transparent, or it should induce equity. But then what is transparency? And what is transparency for you? What is for me? And what is it per country? And then what is sustainability? And then what are the cutoffs? Because we know that, for instance, how they approach water users is different in Italy compared to the Netherlands. And these are all also challenges we are now confronted with. So from a global perspective, but also from a European perspective. And in our ethics lab, we try to make these high over ethical principles more tangible when we are approaching these AI challenges.
Thank you. David, I'd like to ask you how Microsoft is helping from an industry perspective. I think that the clinicians clearly have an important voice in advocating for patients and making sure that local healthcare regulations are abided by. But what about industry? How are you working to partner and test AI models globally?
Yeah, so I want to build off of some of the things that Michelle had talked about. And there is one challenge that is also universal that we see, and that is that the data itself is not even in all cases suitable for AI. There's so much variability. The analogy I use is, if you saw crude oil coming from the ground, could you put that into a canister and fill your gas tank with it, assuming it's one that uses gasoline? Well, obviously no, because it has to be purified. It has to be curated in the form of data. It needs to be annotated. There needs to be a process for taking raw data and converting it into something that is in a format that's useful. And then, of course, there has to be an element of enabling this to be standardized in such a way that we can communicate between different sites. So like leveraging standards like HL7 Fire, OMOP, and things like that. So one of the things that Microsoft has recognized is that if our goal is to create a multimodal data lake that enables AI to be applied on top of it, we actually have to have good data infrastructure. And at the foundational level, it's around data security and privacy and cyber protections and things like that. There has to be a level of, I'll call it capacity, where you can enable large data sets to be stored. So this now really pushes us beyond sort of on-prem to cloud and starts allowing us to think about how we can bring in more than just simply one data set. We oftentimes think of EHR as being the primary source, but of course we have genomics data sets and other types of omics. We have remote monitoring. We have social determinants of health. There's so many other ways that we can analyze individuals. And of course, we need to be able to do this in a way that is longitudinal in nature. So we're capturing this on an ongoing basis relative to certain interventions. And so our ability to create these structures that allow us to be able to then use the AI to be able to provide the analysis in a way that takes the data from multiple sources and brings it to different, we'll call it stages. In Microsoft, we call them medallions, sort of like bronze, silver, gold, sort of like the Olympics. It allows you to be able to understand a higher level of maturity and purification and usefulness. Then from there, we can apply AI on these different areas. And so that is one of the things that we've been doing with a series of, platforms, in particular, something called Fabric. But I also think that the second thing that's important is we're starting to think about how data itself can be taken from an unstructured, raw format, whether it's voice, text, image, video. These sources are now becoming the new sources of data inputs. And as we think about them coming in, those then can be rapidly structured through agents into formats that can allow us to be able to bypass the challenges that we have today with regards to data curation, annotations, curation, things of that sort. So we actually got two things going on at the same time. Our goal is to be able to create a world where the data sets themselves are more easily usable and interoperable between systems so we can apply AI on top of that. And then on top of that, of course, you've got the ability to create federated systems where data can reside where it's at. We can enable privacy preserving collaborations so that the collaborations are done within the microchip so they actually never get exposed. It's not just the data, but also the algorithms, which are essential and also need to be protected from an IP perspective. And so we have now different environments that allow us to be able to do this. And then we have to kind of figure out how to be able to put this into play. And so Microsoft's been involved in many different aspects, from building the technology infrastructure to be able to start thinking about the AI, to be able to convert unstructured to structured, and then, of course, trying to figure out how this all can be applied in meaningful ways. And our hope is that through collaborations with organizations, we'll be able to help further this so that it is done in a way that everyone is participating.
It sounds that like Microsoft really has played a big role in promoting innovation securely and at scale. Michelle, can you comment a little bit more before we open to questions as to how this partnership has impacted the patient care journeys, how you see that being helpful to clinical practice?
Well, by making sure that you have common ground. And the common ground is, yes, we have access to a lot of AI tools and solutions, but we also agree that not much is being operationalized. And then, all right, what then should we develop or improve to make sure that we bridge this gap? And that's exactly where we found each other, by making sure that although we have the ability to develop a solution, we have to make sure that it's being understood by the patient, by the healthcare providers, that we make sure that we test it, that we gather evidence of this testing. And that's actually what we are doing together. And one of the fundamentals then is, for instance, indicate, all right, now we should make sure that we have access to data. Well, now let's build in Europe this federated data learning approach. Well, that requires certain expertise. And now Microsoft is giving us that expertise to make sure that we build the best solution that is out there, but also is adherent to the latest improvements. So that it is sustainable for future purposes, and that is the same. That's the same goal we have and the same mission. And I talked about the example of ambient AI scribe in family ICU meetings, and also in such a very relative use case, simple use case. You encounter a lot of challenges. All right, okay, how then to develop the LLM, how to build a specific prompt. And by working together, you share expertise, you share information, and now we have built a solution, and now we have proved that it can be implemented in our daily workflow and in daily practice. And then we can truly now demonstrate that if we use a certain approach, that indeed healthcare professionals can benefit, and with that also the patients. And I guess that is very important to understand that by working together, you share expertise, you share specific expertise in terms of technology, and we have expertise in how to make sure to approach healthcare providers and patients and implement it in specific clinical settings. And I think that is where we should keep finding each other, is how to make sure that we bridge that gap to, in the end, build responsible AI solutions. And I say specifically responsible because we push on what we think that it should be is transparent, what we think is equitable, and then you should together build it. And that's actually what we are doing right now.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So now we're going to dig into our rapid fire Q&A to talk about what is most important for our audience members in this topic, starting with one question by Malika. How do you go about bias assessment with subpopulations?
Is it a question for me or for David?
You can take it.
All right. Well, yeah, that's a great question. So because in Europe, so from a European perspective, and I use now the Train EU as example, we made it mandatory that at least every organization has a bias assessment. And if you now further delve into this ethical topic, then what is bias for you and what is bias for me? And there are now no frameworks mandatory per country or established by the European legislation. So how we approach it is to make sure that once you have developed and deployed a model, you have to always make sure, let's now take a predictive AI model, the data set that is being trained on. So save the data set somewhere to a drive. Make sure you always have access to it. But not only save the specific data, the training data, but also making sure that you have different characteristics. So how many % of your patients were female? So gender-specific demographics, but also racial demographics, economic demographics. So those are the things we are now trying to implement in our hospital, that we have some sort of bias assessment, because with that, you now maybe from when you're training the model, but also in hindsight, can now encounter, all right, this model is now being trained only on 30% of the patients that were female. Well, is it then truly representative? And how many of these females were older than 70? And how many of these females had that specific type of cancer? But by now storing all these specific demographics, you increase your data volume, and then hopefully in the future it will be accessible and representative for every patient, because that is now not the case, because and that's what David said, because now we do not have all that volume for all these specific challenges, we now develop AI models actually for everybody. And the true ethical challenge is then, should you then not implement the model, or implement it and make sure that the end users are aware that, for instance, the data set contained only 10% female, or only 5% of patients with a specific disease. So that is what we are now doing, and we are hoping that by now implementing this AI registry, that everybody can see these characteristics and then determine for themselves whether it approaches their definitions of a bias assessment.
Yeah, I want to maybe build off of that as well. When we think of bias assessment, oftentimes the initial assumption is the model biased? And when the reality is that's just one component of what we need to do in terms of assessments. We do need to see what is the actual outcome on the individual populations, and is it differ based on subpopulations? And if we were to do that analysis at an individual site, we may be able to get a glimpse into potentially if there's bias. But truly, to answer the question, we do need larger data sets. And then this gets to the question of what we talked about before with train. How do you get larger data sets? Well, perhaps maybe we can work in collaboration through a network effect with other sites to be able to pool the data sets, perhaps in a federated manner, very similar to what Michelle was talking about with Indicate, that we now have an ability to be able to answer those questions. Or perhaps maybe as we think about that next phase of where Train is heading, where we bring in industry partners that are now capturing large data sets through their applications, and now be working closely with them, they can test them on these models on these large data sets that have diverse populations. That's the only way we're going to be able to truly answer this. If we can have the large data sets that are diverse, that are all have been captured in a very similar manner, that allow us to be able to do this. We can do what we can with the current approach, which is where we're at, but we want to get to the point where we can actually work through networking and collaborations and partnerships to be able to answer the bigger question.
Thank you. David, I think you bring up a big point that is of interest to our audience, which is about one, how can we advance the technology and create these big data sets? But two, the audience is curious about the regulatory aspect and what role does industry play there? Farrell asked a very important question about how regulatory bodies are approaching these solutions from an accountability perspective, acknowledging that AI always seems to be held to kind of a higher accountability than humans, because human doctors also make a mistake, but we're still seeing a significantly high hallucination rate or phantom data being a concern. What role does Microsoft play there?
You know, we are involved in a lot of different discussions with, I'll call it collaboration groups, advocacy groups, specialty groups that are all focusing on this area, as well as groups that interact very closely with regulatory bodies. And so, you know, I think one of the things is just through ongoing conversation and opportunities for us to discuss what we're learning, it gives the regulators and others a greater sense of what we're seeing. And what are we seeing? Well, we're seeing that it's not the same game plan as what we did in the past. In the past, it was take a look at a model, test it on a certain large diverse data set, get an FDA approval, and forget about it, or just move on. It's now got a lot more complicated than that. And even when we think about sort of general use cases, we do need to subdivide it into specific subtasks, because at the end of the day, some of these may be very well, I'd say, suitable for what's acceptable today, and some may be a bit farther away. I'll use a consumer as an example. When we think about like how LLMs today are being used in the consumer world, in fact, they are actively being used. You know, consumers are going to these LLMs and asking medical questions. And some may look at that and say, well, that's not right. You know, we shouldn't be doing that. And others may be looking at that and saying that this is great. It's democratizing care. And I think what we have to do is we have to actually take a lens and look at, well, what is working and what's not necessarily working. What is working? We do know that when you have individuals that have complicated stories and they don't understand it, this can help explain it to them. That works. It's something that is very beneficial, and we know it's a solid use case. If you have a person who's not been doing well and they're struggling trying to figure out what, you know, why am I not doing well? Being able to do an analysis to be able to say, well, have you thought of this hypothesis generation? That's a great way. And sometimes clinicians don't even think of these because they're rare diseases or other things. What's a bit challenging is when you start using it for other routine type of clinical decision making, which I feel like we're heading in a direction with multi-agent orchestration, but that's going to require a little bit more testing and validation. And so I think part of what we have to do is have these conversations with the regulators, understand what use cases are actually solid, have a low risk profile, and allow us to be able to put that human involved so that we can actually oversee this process. And then move from there to the cases that perhaps are a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, and I would also like to continue this discussion, because I believe that we as users also have obligation to make sure that we approach in a certain way, because obviously we can regulate. But for instance, what you have seen with the AI Act is that this field is moving so fast that once you come up with regulation, maybe then there's a solution, and then the regulation doesn't cover that specific topic. So for instance, when we are talking now about MBDI scribe, we should also make sure that what we think that should be necessary to warrant safe and high quality healthcare. So for instance, making sure that you have adequate prompting. So then should we save it somewhere? Do we have access to the prompt once? And do we need to update it with every LLM version or LLM update of a different vendor? And then who then has to have access to that prompt? So yes, legislation can help us, but I believe that it will not solve all the challenges to warrant safe use of these AI solutions in healthcare. We also have obligations to make sure that we define what is needed for us to implement it in a safe and responsible way in clinical settings.
I think that's really well said, and equipping clinicians and institutions to care for these patients differently with AI, as Ryan had mentioned in his question that you've just addressed about, how do we equip clinicians in this new age? So thank you for elaborating on everything that you're doing at Erasmus. I would love to talk about this for another hour, but unfortunately, we're coming to a close of today's session. I think we've talked about so much in terms of the collaboration between industry and healthcare organizations in Europe, the promise of European data, making sure that AI is responsibly deployed. I want to leave the floor for some last words, and maybe we'll start with you, David.
Yeah, so the first is I am, first of all, excited on the opportunities for AI. I'm very bullish. AI continues to get better and better, and we're going to see that this can do many of the things that we thought were never possible. First and foremost, it has an opportunity to increase access to affordable healthcare in ways that allow us to screen large populations. It allows us to be able to think about ways we can reduce clinician burden. It allows us to be able to ways that make our care more efficient. So there's so many great things that AI can do. But in order to do this, we have to build trust. We've talked a lot about that. Trust is essential. Trustworthy, responsible AI network, train, indicate, a variety of other organizations are looking to build that trust. But the last thing which we didn't talk about, but Michelle touched upon this, is we do need to also enable an entire workforce to be able to utilize this. And that means an AI upskilling effort where we're starting to learn on how to get people to be familiarized with how to use these tools and then build job programs so that they can actually take advantage of it. And those are the things that we need to be thinking about, not just what can we do from a use case perspective, but responsible trust building and enablement.
Thank you. And Michelle, last words.
No, I believe that David touched upon the most important points, and I believe the last point is one of the most important, because that's what I'm now seeing that is happening in healthcare, but also in the whole AI field, that there tends to be some sort of anxiety towards these solutions. But we should now know that it's not de-skilling, in this case, healthcare physicians, but it's reskilling or upskilling. We are now facing a new world. And I sometimes compare with the car industries or with aviation. Now we have autopilot. That doesn't mean that these pilots are de-skilled. They are upskilled. But there's some sort of a program in place that once their autopilot discontinues, they still have the capabilities fly the plane, and that's what we should warrant in healthcare. So I also encounter this with high trust and confidence, but I also want to urge my fellow peers to not encounter it with anxiety, but know that we are now facing a new era, and we need to upskill our qualities. And I welcome everybody to join the Train initiative. So if you Google Train Europe, you will find us, and then please send us a mail, and I will come back to you.
Well, thank you so much for today's panel, for today's conversation. And yes, everybody looking to train. Okay.
Thank you to Microsoft and to everyone that joined us today. Please visit our website at community.hlth.com to catch up on all health webinars and to watch the recording of today's session. Join us in Las Vegas, October 19th through 22nd for Health USA.